All right, thanks a lot, Stan. We'll come back with more from John Fernandez in just a moment. But joining me now tonight in the studio is Ron Walker, the president of the Bloomington Economic Development Corporation, and Amy Vaughn, the director of the Indiana Office of Tourism Development, and Dr. Jerry Conover, director of the Indiana Business Research Center. Thank you all so much for being on the show. We really appreciate it. Let's continue the conversation that Stan was having with Mr. Fernandez there and talk about the current state of the economy in Indiana. First of all, I would like to start with Dr. Conover, if we might, and talk about where we should be looking at this moment. Should we be looking at it what is many consider the old way, bringing more jobs, manufacturing jobs, that kind of thing, into the state of Indiana, which is kind of the old standby, not a bad way, but just is the old way of looking at it? Or should we be looking at things in a new way, in terms of new kinds of jobs?
Yes and yes.
Yes and yes, okay. Elaborate.
Well, the manufacturing has been the cornerstone of Indiana's economy for more than a century, and it will always, I believe, have a significant place in the manufacturing world, but that place is changing, it's evolving. Manufacturing now is quite a bit different than it was 20 years ago or even 10 years ago, and it continues to change. So we've seen a lot of manufacturing jobs go away. About half the jobs the state has lost in the past year have come from manufacturing. And I don't think we'll ever be back to the number of people working in manufacturing that we had, say, 10 or 15 years ago in Indiana. The kinds of manufacturing jobs that will remain and that have real potential to stimulate the economy are going to be producing different types of products in different ways where we can compete effectively on the world scale. That calls for different thinking about where the strengths are, what lines of goods make more sense to produce elsewhere, and which ones we need to focus on here.
Okay. Amy, if we could go to you, what are new ways that maybe we should be looking at jobs and economy within the state of Indiana?
Well, certainly from a tourism perspective, I think a lot of people don't realize that Indiana has 62 million visitors each year. The visitors spend $10 billion, and tourism brings 250,000 jobs to the state. So I think increasingly as we talk about diversifying our employment base, that tourism is another important area to look at.
And we'll get to that more in just a few minutes, but I'd like to go to you, Ron, and speak about Bloomington in general, Monroe County in general. How are we diversifying, our jobs here in the county?
We've been fortunate in the last 10 years as we've seen manufacturing jobs leave. Some of them that our unemployment rate hasn't changed that much during much of that time until the recession, because we've seen growth in other areas, particularly information technology, services, some hotel and food accommodation, but also life sciences. The industry, which is, much of it is a manufacturing or production industry.
Right.
So we were fortunate, obviously, to have Indiana University and Ivy Tech, but we've been lucky in our growth. And it's not just entirely luck, it's by design. We've had efforts across the community to strengthen those sectors, and it's helped us. I believe our manufacturing manufacturing is about 12% or so of our total employment. I always check with Dr. Conover on those numbers because I tend to get them from you, but that's what I recall at least.
It's significant. It's above the average.
What I found interesting is actually I looked at the Connexus Indiana report from last year, 2009 in Indiana, and it basically gave Indiana an A for manufacturing and wages, which is great. Gave it a B for logistics, but the one that really stood out to me was they gave it a D+ for human capital, meaning that there are less people in Indiana getting college degrees, things like that, and that's where we really need to work. What do you say to that?
I would certainly echo the significant importance of human capital and investing in the skills and abilities of the workforce as a key to Indiana's future. We're competing with other places that have substantially stronger workforce qualifications in many cases. Our workforce has a lot of experience in making things and moving things around,
right,
and that sort of thing, but as I mentioned earlier, with the manufacturing world changing the way it is, the ways that people need to be trained and educated to handle the kinds of jobs that will be in demand here is changing as well. We need people to go beyond high school to learn more technical skills, to learn skills about how to work effectively and efficiently in workplaces, whatever industry they're in, so that they can help be the competitive workforce that will land jobs here and keep them employed gainfully.
And as we move towards a climate where there's less manufacturing jobs, we need that even more, obviously. Well, let's move to what Amy was talking about earlier, which is cultural tourism and the role of that in the state of Indiana. I'm going to start with you, Amy, on this, actually. How are we looking right now in terms of bringing more of the arts, cultural, and the sports cultural tourism into the state?
Well, if I can, I'd like to just touch briefly as kind of a broad overview of Indiana's tourism industry. And we have an Indiana Tourism Council that meets quarterly that gives us an update, kind of a state of Indiana's tourism industry. And so at our December meeting, we asked our members present, included hotels and restaurants, attractions, shops, to kind of give us the state of the state. And generally speaking, what we heard was that overall Indiana's attractions fared fairly well in 2009. And anecdotally, I can tell you that, for example, in Fort Wayne, the Fort Wayne Children's Zoo, their attendance was up 15% this year. Now, they had new product this year, and so certainly that played a big part. Their baseball stadium had record attendance. We heard the same kind of thing in Indianapolis at Conner Prairie, new balloon exhibit. Attendance tripled all expectations. Children's Museum attendance because of the King Tut exhibit, right, over 1 million this year. Holiday World, attendance was up 3% this year. So what we heard at this Tourism Council meeting was that in a tough year, absolutely a tough year across the board, generally speaking, our attractions, in some instances, really fared far better than they thought they would. Generally speaking, kind of held steady from an attraction standpoint. But what we also heard from a hotel standpoint was, boy, tough times in the hotel industry, that rate is down, occupancy is down, so it looks like we've got more challenges ahead in hotel, and also in the restaurant industry as well, that higher-end restaurants are scaling back, closing at lunchtime, and generally speaking, we see that because consumer confidence is still kind of hovering around this 50-ish mark, that we don't anticipate that 2010 will be dramatically different from 2009 in terms of the tourism industry, but we feel like we learned a lot in 2009 to put to good use in 2010.
I think it is very interesting. We just saw a video there of a water park in French Lick, and you see pockets of areas like French Lick, West Baden. You talked about Holiday World, those kinds of places that people are staying within the state. So, hey, we're going to go somewhere close.
I think that's absolutely a great point, that what we saw this year was a lot of people staying closer to home. We think that'll continue this year. Big emphasis on value. And Indiana is always we're a drive-to destination, we're very affordable, so value and affordability is a big part of our product. So we think that'll play a big role this year. The piece we're looking at, of course, for this year is gas prices, because we're hearing that gas prices may start to creep up. And what we saw a couple of years ago when that happened is that at $4 gas, that was really a tipping point where it changed behavior. And so that's certainly something that we think could make a big difference this year.
We'll get back to that in just a minute. Now let's go to Stan, who continues his discussion with John Fernandez. Stan?
Thanks, Ann. We're back with Assistant Secretary of Commerce and former Bloomington Mayor John Fernandez. I wanted to ask one more question about something that came up in Governor Daniels' State of the State address this week, and that was that he said the state should work to improve its manufacturing economy, whether that's more auto manufacturing in places like Kokomo or expanding green manufacturing for renewable power sources. From the point of view of the future of the state's economy, do you think it's a good idea to improve the manufacturing sector, or would it be smarter to go into something like research?
The true source of net new job creation is in small and medium-sized enterprises, and most of these are very driven by innovation. And so what we need to do in Indiana, as well as across the country, is work in a regional collaborative way to align all the public-private partnerships and relevant groups to create an environment where innovation can thrive. We know from quite a bit of research that manufacturing plays a critical role in not just the jobs created in terms of the production of goods, but also in terms of being a magnet for the higher end research and development. So manufacturing is absolutely essential, whether it's in modifying advanced manufacturing techniques around existing industries like the auto industry in Indiana, but also certainly supporting green technology and the development of the green power sources and all the equipment and processes engaged with that part of our economy.
I wanted to ask you also, I don't know how you've been following the property tax cap debate that's been going on back here in Indiana, but it now appears that voters in November are going to get to vote on a referendum in which they will decide whether property tax caps of 1%, 2%, and 3% for different types of businesses or properties go permanently into the state's constitution. From the point of view of the future of the state's economy, do you think that putting those caps permanently in the Constitution is a good idea?
Well, I think people know what my positions have been on that. I think that the fact of the matter is, with or without a constitutional amendment, there's already statutory authority that puts in place those caps. I still stay in touch with a lot of my colleagues and former colleagues in the state, and there's grave concern about the impact of doing that kind of permanent constitutional change will have not just on cities but on public education and other really important institutions. So, if we've learned anything, I think, a lot of these kinds of legislative initiatives to put caps on property taxes, or, you look at the state of California, look at Michigan and other places that have done these kinds of referendum-driven policies, is that, years out, it creates a lot of unintended negative consequences. So I think, constitutional amendments are really big deals, and if you've already got a statute in place, it just seems like an unnecessary step, but that's just my opinion.
I want to close up our conversation by asking a bit of a forward-looking question, and that is, I think everybody wants to know exactly when the economy is going to turn around, and obviously none of us knows exactly, but what's your sense? Do you think it'll be 2010 that the economy begins to rebound, or will we have to look a little bit further forward on the calendar to see that sort of economic turnaround in this country?
Well, I think that, when it comes to trying to build a sustainable economic development strategy and plan, if you will, for our country, these are not short-term initiatives. I think we'll continue to see real progress throughout this year. As we look at these things, the whole goal here is to get us away from this cycle of boom and bust. And if we invest in an innovation economy, if we invest in, the process of building an entrepreneurial society, if you will, those are the kinds of investments that over time really get us away from this boom and bust cycle, and that's critically important. So, while we saw a dramatic decline, I think it's fair to say that the recovery is, in terms of job creation, is going to be incremental, and I don't think anyone's prepared to say that you're going to see a rapid turnaround to the point to replace all, several million jobs that were lost over the last several years. I think you're going to see steady progress, though, and that's important.
John Fernandez is a former mayor of the city of Bloomington and currently a U.S. Assistant Secretary of Commerce. Mr. Fernandez, thanks so much for your time. We appreciate it.
Thank you, Stan.
And back to you in the studio.
All right. Thanks so much, Stan.